The Feather Standard Revelation. My name is Alex. I'm a USDA Food Safety Inspector, a title that means nothing to anyone until you realize I am standing between your family and a bad batch of botulism. Outside of work, I'm just that guy who works for the government. But when I'm on the clock, I am a living, breathing, 5'9" repository of the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, Title 9, Subchapter E, Parts 300 to 592. My job is to make absolutely certain the chicken you're eating isn't going to kill you. It's a noble, tedious, and often infuriating job. I've spent 10 years walking the cold, pungent floors of slaughterhouses and processing plants, places tiled white so that the slightest speck of contamination is instantly visible. In those 10 years, I've seen small, family-owned farms meticulously follow every single rule, and I've seen massive conglomerates, worth 10,000 times my annual salary, treat every regulation as a spiteful, unnecessary hurdle. It's the latter group that I deal with most, and my current thorn in the side is Victor Sterling, the Vice President of Operations for AgriCorp. AgriCorp isn't just a company, it's an empire. They control about 40% of the processed poultry market in this region. And Victor is the human embodiment of the phrase, I need to speak to your manager, and I pay your taxes. He wears pinstriped suits, smells aggressively of expensive cologne, and approaches me every morning like he's campaigning in a small town. Ah, Inspector Ridley. There you are. Do you know how important you are to us? He'd say, the condescension barely hidden beneath a veneer of practiced charm. He always said to us, as if I existed purely for the continuation of his quarterly profits. Look, Alex, I know you've got the usual schedule today, truckload checks, facility integrity reports. Very important stuff. But we have a critical consignment, a new, major account. You know the type, it needs to get out ASAP. Can we just, do the usual visual, sign off the main log, and skip the deep dive on the refrigerated units? We're running a little tight. He wouldn't say skip the inspection. He'd say streamline the process. He wouldn't say break the law. He'd say exercise reasonable discretion. I always gave him the same answer. Mr. Sterling, the purpose of a random, deep dive inspection is to ensure facility integrity and compliance, not to accommodate your logistics schedule. If I sign off without performing the legally mandated random sample, I violate CFR 325.2, and your entire load is subject to retention. I'm starting with the cooling unit log in 5 minutes. Get me the manifest. He'd sigh, his perfectly tailored shoulders slumping dramatically, as if I had just personally slapped his infant child. This is exactly why we need budget cuts in DC, he'd mutter under his breath as he walked away, a comment meant to sting because he knew I was career civil service. That was the background radiation of my life at AgriCorp. The constant, grinding pressure to look the other way, to go faster, to be reasonable. I was the immovable object, and Victor was the entitled force trying to move me with passive-aggressive force. But the incident that broke me, the one that forced me to lock up the AgriCorp Karen of the USDA system, happened on a brutally hot Tuesday in July. I was conducting a routine check on a new shipment of automated processing equipment. These things are massive, stainless steel monsters that pluck, process, and pack poultry at inhuman speeds. My job was to verify that the manufacturer's operational manual, specifically concerning internal cleaning ports, matched the specifications in AgriCorp's Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points, HACP, plan. In English, can they clean the machine without disassembling the whole thing? I was deep under one of these behemoths, flashlight in my mouth, wearing a hard hat and a look of pure concentration, comparing a serial number on a flange to the diagram in a book that smelled faintly of ammonia and chicken fat. Victor Sterling chose that exact moment to appear. He wasn't alone. He was escorting 3 people in business suits, clearly high-level executives, maybe investors, or perhaps the folks from their major new customer. They were dressed for a boardroom, looking utterly miserable in the fluorescent, chilly, and damp environment of the plant floor. Victor was giving them the look at our efficient operation tour. He spotted my legs sticking out from under the machine. "Ah, excuse us, team," Victor boomed, loud enough to echo off the steel walls. Just running into our government partner. We're so transparent. We let them crawl all over the place. Literally. Inspector Ridley is just inspecting, as usual. He gave a dry, corporate chuckle that hung in the air like dust. I could hear his entourage politely, fakely joining in. I ignored him. I had a job to do. But Victor wasn't done. He took a single, significant step closer and actually kicked the sole of my boot. Not hard, but enough to make me jerk my head and hit it on a pipe. Hey, Alex, how about you wrap that up? We're going to take a photo op of the new facility sign, and we don't want any, visual clutter. Visual clutter. That's what I was. A necessary, but unsightly, obstacle to his perfect corporate narrative. I pulled myself out, rubbing the small knot forming on my forehead, trying to remain calm. My uniform was slightly damp from condensation, and my face was flushed. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice low and level. I'm conducting a critical equipment verification. I'm comparing the cleaning port diameter to the mandated brush size for pathogen control. It's part of your hack plan. You know this. Victor just smiled that patronizing, teeth-clenched smile and gestured to the three executives. Look, Inspector, we know you're thorough. Very thorough. But we've got people with multi-million-dollar deals waiting. You've been down here for 40 minutes. If you could just give us the all clear for now, that would be great. We can finish this exercise later. He wasn't asking. He was ordering, in front of his audience, explicitly trying to diminish my authority and make me look like a time-wasting bureaucrat. It was a power move, a public humiliation designed to show his executives that he controlled the floor, not the federal inspector. My blood pressure spiked. I stared at him, then at his three miserable guests, and then I saw it. It wasn't the cleaning port. It wasn't the condensation. It was the fleet. Outside the main warehouse doors, AgriCorp had lined up a new fleet of refrigerated tractor-trailers, all ready to haul the day's production. They were pristine white, branded with a shiny new logo, and they represented millions of dollars in capital investment and transport contracts. They were Victor Sterling's pride and joy, the symbol of his efficient logistics operation. The light bulb didn't just flicker. It detonated in my head. I had been looking for a problem in the chicken. I had been looking for a problem in the plant. I had failed to look for a problem in the delivery method. And then I remembered Title 9, Subchapter E, Part 381.185. The Poultry Products Inspection Act, PPIA. The subsection is so obscure, so rarely cited, that most modern inspectors skip right over it. It deals with sanitation standards for vehicles used to transport inspected and passed poultry products. And buried deep within its appendices, revised in 1983, the Feather Standard Revision, as the old-timers call it, was a tiny, specific requirement regarding the cleanliness of the exterior of all transport vehicles. It was designed to prevent the cross-contamination of live birds arriving at the plant and processed birds leaving it. But it had a wonderfully broad application. Victor Sterling had just kicked me. In front of his high-value clients, he had treated the federal government's entire food safety mandate like visual clutter. My turn. I took a deep breath, and the rage translated into the calmest, most boring bureaucratic voice I could muster. Mr. Sterling, I said, putting my clipboard under my arm. I'm concluding this specific part of the hack verification for now. Victor beamed, triumphant. Excellent. See, team? Flexibility. Let's move on. However, I cut in, raising one finger. Before we proceed to the exterior signage, I need to conduct a mandatory inspection of the new transport fleet. He froze. The trucks? Why? CFR 381.185, Mr. Sterling. The regulations stipulate that the inspector must verify that all vehicles carrying passed product are maintained in a clean and sanitary condition. This includes the vehicle's exterior. Failure to comply results in an immediate notice of non-compliance and the indefinite grounding of the entire fleet until reinspection is completed. Victor laughed, a short, sharp bark. Alex, they are brand new. They were washed an hour ago. They are spotless. Look at them. I didn't look at them. I looked at him. I am going to inspect them for compliance with Appendix B, Section 4, Subsection C, Paragraph 2. The removal of all extraneous animal material, including feathers, dust, and particulate matter, from the exterior surface prior to loading. He sputtered. Feathers? Alex, these trucks haul chicken. A feather or two is ambient reality. You're going to hold up a multi-million-dollar delivery over a single feather. I am going to hold up a multi-million-dollar delivery over a single, violating feather, Mr. Sterling, I corrected him calmly. And based on the scope of the new fleet, I estimate the inspection will take approximately 3 to 5 hours per vehicle. You have 20 vehicles. That puts us at a 30 to 40-hour inspection window. And since you just interrupted a critical hack check, I'm afraid you'll have to wait in the viewing room until I complete this new, more critical, mandatory inspection. Effective immediately, the fleet is under USDA hold. Do not attempt to move them. I then turned my back on the stunned corporate executives and the now silent Victor Sterling, grabbed my clipboard, and strode out the door toward his 20 shiny, perfect, and now utterly useless trucks. I could feel Victor's eyes burning holes in my USDA vest. I was about to embark on the most glorious, tedious, and exquisitely justified act of bureaucratic revenge of my career. And I knew exactly where to start looking. The tiny gap where the refrigeration unit met the cab roof. A perfect feather trap. Game on, Victor. Game on. The inheritance of hunger, the gardener's ledger, and the butcher's bill. The humid air of the attic was now firmly woven into the house's atmosphere, a creeping, organic odor that displaced the scent of dust and rot. Chloe couldn't shake the primal terror she felt, but Liam was galvanized. The initial shock had been replaced by a manic, focused determination that shone in his eyes. We need the ledger, he announced, striding back down the creaking stairs. She wouldn't leave a condition like this without instructions. We have 48 hours, maybe less, before those things start deteriorating. They looked hungry. Chloe reluctantly followed. Her fear was still a physical weight in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a more pressing dread. The fear of what Liam might become if he maintained his devotion to this hideous flora. She was already feeling the residual drain from the attic, a lingering weakness that made her bones ache. The search led them back to the dining room, where Mr. Thorne had left the will. Tucked inside the briefcase pocket that had held the key, they found it. A small, leather-bound volume that looked like a 19th-century accounts book. Its pages were filled with Alara Carter's neat, spidery script. It wasn't a diary. It was a meticulous gardener's ledger. The first entries were mundane, weather notes, utility bills, but they quickly descended into the obsessive. The columns were labeled not for profit and loss, but for input, output, and vibrancy index. Look at this, Liam whispered, tracing a finger over an entry dated 10 years prior. Input, standard butcher's cut, quantity 10 pounds. Output, average, 7, vibrancy, stable. Chloe peered closer. The output column featured not pounds, but a series of unsettling, hand-drawn symbols that looked vaguely like human organs. A kidney, a lung, a twisted length of intestine. What is the vibrancy index? Chloe demanded, pushing aside the visceral disgust. Liam flipped to the frontispiece. In looping, precise handwriting, Alara had included a glossary. The vibrancy index measures the return on investment. 10 is maximum vitality, temporary youth. Below 5 is rapid decay. 0 indicates forfeiture and immediate consumption of the gardener. Chloe slammed the book shut, her hands shaking. Consumption? Liam, we are burning this house down. Now. This isn't just organic fertilizer. This is a feeding schedule for something predatory. Liam gently took the ledger back, his voice unnervingly calm. We can't, Chloe. The will. The forfeiture clause. And what if she was right? What if she maintained this for 30 years because it was valuable? Look at the dates. She started this garden when she was nearly 70. She lived to be 95 in perfect health, completely alone. She never aged, not really. This is the source of her longevity. He turned to the core pages, the formula. The formula was a complex, handwritten recipe for the sustenance, requiring specific cuts, but more importantly, a detailed preparatory process. The key component, which Ilara had underlined repeatedly in fading red ink, was listed as the catalyst, bone meal, unprocessed, and marrow. Blood, type O positive, stabilized. All components must be fresh, dense, and non-toxic. The final component must be mixed with the soil every 48 hours. The last entry in the ledger was scrawled just 3 days before Ilara's death. The script slightly shaky, input, reduced. Vibrancy, 3, insufficient. Must replenish immediately. The hunger grows. Reduced input, Liam muttered, his brow furrowed. That's why she died. She couldn't maintain the full formula. The plants consumed her faster than she could feed them. Or they just grew tired of her, Chloe whispered, suddenly recalling the raw, musky scent of the attic. The immediate crisis was the 48-hour window. They had less than a day remaining before the nourish command failed. Liam grabbed the keys. We need the butcher, he stated, his decision final. The local butcher shop, the Old Mill Butcher, was located in a ramshackle building near the old river dam, 10 miles from the farmhouse. It was a place that smelled permanently of brine, sawdust, and the metallic tang of chilled meat. The butcher himself, a hulking man named Silas, no relation to the nervous lawyer, looked like he hadn't smiled since the Cold War. His apron was spotless, his eyes were cold and professional, and he didn't ask questions. We need the usual order, Liam said, trying to sound confident. Ilara Carter's order. The one for the specialized needs. The butcher didn't blink. He reached beneath the counter without a word, retrieving a package wrapped in heavy, thick brown butcher paper, tied tightly with twine. It weighed far more than it looked, possessing an unsettling, almost stone-like density. She paid 6 weeks in advance, the butcher said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. This is the final package from her last cycle. You look thinner than she did, boy. You the new gardener. Liam flinched, but quickly masked it with a tight smile. We inherited the property. Just following the instructions. Instructions, the butcher repeated, nodding slowly. They have very specific needs, those special cuts. Don't cheap out on them. She never did. He slid the package across the counter. As Liam reached for it, Silas the butcher spoke one last time, his voice dropping low. And remember the rule, young gardener. The garden only takes what the gardener willingly offers. She was very clear about that. Liam froze, pulling his hand back as if burned. What does that mean? Silas gave him a look of profound pity, the only emotional flicker Chloe had yet seen from him. It means you pay the bill, Mr. Carter. You pay the price. Always. They paid the invoice, a staggering price for specialty cuts, and left in a hurry, the heavy package cold and clammy between them. Back at the farmhouse, Chloe pleaded with Liam one last time. That man knew exactly what he was selling her. This isn't food, Liam. This is a ritual sacrifice. We walk away now. We lose the house, but we keep our lives. No, Liam said, his voice hard. He unwrapped the butcher paper, revealing the content. It wasn't a steak. It wasn't a roast. It was a dense, almost spherical mass of grayish-pink tissue, surrounded by bone fragments that had been meticulously bleached and ground into a rough powder. It looked like high-quality muscle tissue, but it possessed no discernible fat, and the scent, when the wrapping was fully peeled away, was faintly sweet and overpoweringly metallic. It pulsed faintly, cold to the touch. The catalyst, Liam breathed, picking up the bone meal powder. He worked with an almost religious fervor, consulting the ledger. He found a strange ceramic bowl and a set of silver instruments in the utility room, tools their grandmother had clearly used. Following the archaic instructions, he mixed the ground bone and the tissue mass with a small, precise quantity of his own blood, drawn with a ritualistic pinprick to his finger, a tiny, symbolic sacrifice. As the mixture was completed, Liam looked pale, exhausted by the meticulous labor, but utterly satisfied. He carried the bowl up to the humid, purple-lit attic, Chloe lingering reluctantly in the doorway. "I have to do this alone, Chloe," Liam ordered, his eyes locked on the thriving, pulsing garden. The gardener must perform the offering. He approached the black, shimmering soil bed. The plants seemed to lean toward him, the fleshy, membranous petals of the central plant trembling rapidly. The rhythmic thumping increased in speed, now sounding like a desperate heart rhythm. Liam knelt, scooping handfuls of the viscous mixture onto the soil bed around the largest plants. The reaction was instantaneous and terrible. The black soil drank the mixture, sucking it down with a voracious, audible slurp. The plants shuddered, not with fear, but with ecstatic energy. The colors deepened. The reds became the shade of fresh arterial blood. The purple lights flared intensely. The bulbous, organ-shaped sacs began to inflate and deflate with violent speed. And then came the sound. The low sucking and thumping faded, replaced by a delicate, high-pitched chirping noise, like hundreds of satisfied baby birds. The atmosphere in the attic thickened, becoming almost narcotic. Liam stood up, throwing the empty bowl aside. The pallor was gone. He was radiant, vibrant, flushed with a powerful, electric surge of energy. His eyes were wide, clear, and intensely focused on the garden. He looked 10 years younger, all the stress lines around his mouth and eyes momentarily erased. "It works, Chloe," he breathed, the words heavy with awe and reverence. "It actually works. Look at the vitality." Chloe, watching from the threshold, felt a violent retching reflex. The energy that had rushed into Liam was a void in her. The sickness that had briefly lifted returned tenfold, coupled with a crushing headache and a chilling suspicion. The butcher had said, "The garden only takes what the gardener willingly offers." Liam had offered a symbolic drop of his blood. But the garden had just consumed something else, a sacrifice paid for by their grandmother, and now, it was drawing its return on investment not just from the fertilizer, but from the immediate vicinity. The vibrancy had rushed into Liam, but it had drained out of Chloe. The energy of the garden was not created, it was transferred. And now that Liam had taken charge, the garden had chosen its preferred source of latent vitality. The uninitiated, the unwilling, the sister who stood closest to the fortified door. The inheritance was a closed-loop system, and she was already beginning to realize she was the spare battery. The clock, the council, and the clipboard. The next day felt less like a job and more like a theatrical performance, with me in the role of the quiet, clipboard-wielding Grim Reaper, and Victor Sterling starring as the sweating, rapidly unraveling antagonist. I arrived precisely at 7 a.m. Victor, who usually sauntered in at 8:30 a.m., was already there, hovering near the loading dock, looking like he'd slept in his pinstriped suit. Beside him stood a woman, sharply dressed, radiating the highly specific, aggressive calmness of high-powered corporate litigation. She introduced herself simply as Ms. Harrington, AgriCorp's lead counsel. "Inspector Ridley," Ms. Harrington said, her voice smooth and devoid of any emotion, like polished marble. "I reviewed your notice of non-compliance. We are of the opinion that the citation of CFR 381.185 regarding extraneous animal material, based on a microscopic quantity of pulverized barbules is, at minimum, an overreach of administrative discretion and, at maximum, harassment." I gave her a bland, professional smile. "Ms. Harrington, with all due respect, my opinion is that the law is the law. The regulation does not stipulate a minimum quantity of contamination. It requires the exterior surface to be free of it. If even one spore of avian contamination is present, the vehicle is non-compliant. Furthermore, Section 381.185(b) requires me to ground the vehicle upon detection. I am not exercising discretion. I am following a direct mandate." She narrowed her eyes, clearly assessing my demeanor. She was looking for weakness, for a hint of personal motivation she could exploit. I gave her none. I was a blank slate wearing a USDA vest. "We have had the entire fleet professionally washed twice since your initial inspection," she continued, holding up a file folder stuffed with invoices. "The corrective action has been taken. We demand immediate reinspection and release of the remaining 18 vehicles." I nodded slowly, taking the file. That's excellent, Ms. Harrington. However, the regulation requires me to conduct the reinspection at the same level of rigor as the initial inspection, or at an increased level, given the documented history of noncompliance. Since the initial noncompliance was only detectable via forensic level 3 verification, which took 4 hours per truck, I must assume that level of scrutiny is now necessary for all 20 vehicles. Victor visibly deflated. 40 hours. You can't be serious. That's 2 full days of lost transport. We're losing millions in chilled product and contract penalties. I am completely serious, Mr. Sterling, I confirmed, pulling out my clipboard. I am beginning the reinspection of Truck 1 now. I also note that the original samples taken from Trucks 3 and 4 have been submitted for lab analysis, and the results will be cross-referenced with your internal hack blogs. If the lab confirms the avian source, the penalties against AgriCorp for failing to maintain sanitary transport areas will escalate dramatically. Ms. Harrington realized immediately that I wasn't going to be bullied. She switched tactics, attempting to tie me up in paperwork. Fine. If you insist on this ridiculous schedule, we will provide an AgriCorp inspector to shadow you for the entire process, documenting every single action you take, for the inevitable administrative appeal. I smiled sweetly. I welcome it. But please ensure your representative adheres to all USDA safety regulations, including wearing the correct sterile footwear, hairnet, and designated safety glasses at all times when within the inspection zone. Any violation by your representative is grounds for a temporary suspension of my inspection, as it constitutes a distraction that compromises the integrity of my work area, per CFR 381.185, d. Harrington's lips pressed into a thin line. She knew I had checkmated her. If her inspector was perfect, it proved the inspection was legitimate. If her inspector slipped up, I could take a break and drag the process out even further. She sent over a nervous, young paralegal named Kevin, who looked utterly miserable and kept tripping over his safety boots. I started the reinspection on Truck 1, which had been thoroughly power-washed. I was looking for the tiny failures, the spots the industrial washers couldn't reach, or that the manual scrubbing missed. And sure enough, the power of water can't defeat the tenacity of grease and static electricity. I spent the first hour on the truck's front grille, meticulously checking the fins. Nothing. The second hour, the side panel rivets. Clean. The third hour, the tiny, almost invisible gap around the hinge of the trailer's rear door. Bingo. Using my pick, I extracted 3 microscopic specks of dried, brownish-red material. Violation reconfirmed, I stated calmly to Kevin, who was frantically typing notes on a tablet. Truck 1. Non-compliance confirmed. Extraneous material consistent with dried organic matter, likely avian blood residue, adhering to the rear door hinge seal. This indicates the door was not fully sterilized after being exposed to the loading dock environment and before the subsequent washing. I labeled the slide and taped it to the truck's yellow non-compliance sticker. I was no longer finding stray feathers. I was finding failures in AgriCorp's post-loading cleaning protocol. This was worse. This suggested a systemic failure, not just bad luck. The pressure intensified. Victor, realizing that I was finding new, distinct violations even after their corrective action, was getting desperate. He started attempting to bribe me, subtly, of course. Alex, he said, pulling me aside, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. Look, this is absurd. We both know this is about yesterday. I apologize. Truly. I was out of line. Here's what I propose. Sign off on these trucks, and I'll ensure that for the next year, you'll only be assigned to facilities outside the AgriCorp network. How does a year of checking small, clean, compliant farms sound? No more Victor, no more AgriCorp headaches. The offer was tempting. A year of peace and quiet. But the sheer audacity, the blatant attempt to manipulate a federal process, just solidified my resolve. I looked him straight in the eye. Mr. Sterling, you are offering a quid pro quo to circumvent federal food safety law. Under Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 201, that is a felony punishable by up to 15 years in federal prison. Please Please ensure any future conversations you have with me adhere strictly to regulatory compliance matters. Victor went ghost white. He finally understood that I wasn't just petty, I was lethal. I went back to work on truck 2. By the end of the day, I had logged 3 full re-inspections, trucks 1, 2, and 3, finding subtle, new contamination on all of them. The total grounded fleet count remained 20, and the projected release date was now 2 days further out. As I left for the evening, Ms. Harrington approached me again, her calm facade completely gone, replaced by frustration. Inspector, you have essentially shut down our logistics operation using a standard that has not been enforced in 40 years. We will see you in court. We will file an immediate emergency injunction against the USDA. I shrugged, zipping up my USDA jacket. You certainly can, Ms. Harrington. But I would advise you to read CFR 381.185. C, one more time. It states that the Secretary's determination of sanitation standards is not subject to judicial review. Good luck with your injunction. See you tomorrow at 7 a.m. I left her standing there, defeated by the absolute, non-reviewable power of a single, obscure regulation. The silence of the grounded fleet behind her was the sound of sweet bureaucratic justice. The escalation and the political play. Day 3 dawned, and I felt a perverse sense of satisfaction as I parked my modest government-issued sedan next to Ms. Harrington's sleek, black executive car. She was already there, pacing near the loading dock, her perfect suit now showing the faint rumples of 2 sleepless nights. Victor Sterling was nowhere in sight. Perhaps he had finally cracked, or more likely, he was plotting his next move from a safe distance. I began my inspection of truck 4, meticulously checking the minuscule gap where the license plate screws met the frame. This was an often overlooked spot, a perfect repository for fine dust and, occasionally, tiny insect parts, which could also be classified as extraneous animal material if the insect was avian-borne. The silence from Ms. Harrington and the AgriCorp paralegal, Kevin, was deafening. They watched me, their faces grim, their hope draining with every careful sweep of my pick. Around 9 a.m., my government-issued cell phone, which usually only received alerts about mandatory online ethics training, rang with a DC area code. I answered, expecting Chief Willis, my direct supervisor. Inspector Ridley, this is Senator Caldwell's office. The senator would like to speak with you regarding an urgent matter concerning the AgriCorp facility in your jurisdiction. My eyebrows shot up. A senator? Victor had gone political. This was a classic play. When regulations become too inconvenient, apply political pressure to make them disappear. I am currently conducting a mandatory federal inspection, Senator, I stated calmly, deliberately keeping my voice neutral so Ms. Harrington, who was now intently watching me, couldn't discern the nature of the call. My duties require my full attention. Is this a matter of national security? The senator's aide, a crisp, impatient voice, replied, it concerns the disruption of a critical national food supply chain. The senator is on the line. A deep, authoritative voice came on. Inspector Ridley, this is Senator Caldwell. I understand you've initiated a rather extensive inspection at AgriCorp. My office has received a formal complaint regarding what appears to be an unprecedented and potentially punitive interpretation of USDA regulations, directly impacting AgriCorp's ability to fulfill vital contracts. I paused, looking at the tiny speck of dust I had just scraped from Truck 4's license plate frame. It definitely had a wing fragment. Senator, I began, my voice clear and measured, my inspection is based entirely on CFR 381.185, a federal regulation governing the sanitary condition of vehicles transporting inspected poultry products. AgriCorp's fleet was found to be in violation, and I am conducting a re-inspection. My authority for this is non-reviewable by any judicial or administrative body, as per the explicit language of subsection C of that same regulation. There was a beat of silence on the line. The senator, I suspected, was not used to USDA inspectors quoting federal law back to him, especially the non-reviewable part. Inspector, the senator said, his tone hardening. Are you implying that a single inspector can unilaterally shut down a multi-billion-dollar corporation's logistics based on dust? I am implying, Senator, that the law defines extraneous animal material broadly, and my findings have been consistent. AgriCorp's vehicles are failing to meet the mandated sanitary standards for the safe transport of a federally inspected food product. My duty is to protect the consumer, not AgriCorp's profit margins. Furthermore, any attempt to interfere with a federal inspection could lead to criminal charges against those involved in the interference, including corporate officers and, potentially, anyone attempting to influence the inspection. I made sure to emphasize the last part. Another, longer silence. Then the senator's voice, now clipped. I see. Thank you for your clarification, Inspector. This matter will be reviewed. The line went dead. I looked up to see Ms. Harrington staring at me, her face pale. She had clearly heard enough to understand that their political gambit had just hit a brick wall. The non-reviewable clause was my legal shield, protecting me from exactly this kind of pressure. I went back to Truck 4. It also got a non-compliance sticker. By noon, the situation at AgriCorp was spiraling. The processing plant itself was still operating, but the entire output, tens of thousands of pounds of chilled poultry, was piling up in their holding freezers, unable to be shipped. The cost of storage alone, let alone the loss of fresh product and penalties for missed deliveries, was staggering. Victor Sterling finally reappeared, looking utterly defeated. He looked like a man who had not slept, eaten, or showered in days. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, hollow anxiety. Ridley, he rasped, his voice raw. This is insane. We're going to go bankrupt. My career is over. You've destroyed us over a few specks. You kicked my boot, Mr. Sterling. I reminded him quietly, my voice devoid of triumph, merely stating a fact. You called me visual clutter in front of your executives. You tried to use political influence to override federal law. I am simply applying the law you constantly ignored. He slumped against a concrete pillar, defeated. What do you want? What will make this stop? I looked at him, then at the endless line of grounded trucks. This wasn't just about Victor anymore. It was about the systemic arrogance of AgriCorp, the belief that they were above the rules designed to protect the very public they served. I want a comprehensive, top-to-bottom reevaluation of every sanitation protocol in this entire facility, not just the trucks, I stated. I want a new, dedicated, on-site sanitation officer, certified by the USDA, whose sole job is to ensure continuous compliance, not just when an inspector is present. And I want that officer to report directly to my office, not to AgriCorp management, for a period of no less than 1 year. Victor's head snapped up. Report directly to you? You want to essentially install a USDA spy in our operations. I want a federally approved overseer ensuring that your efficiency never again compromises public health, I corrected him. And I want all 20 trucks thoroughly stripped, cleaned to a medically sterile standard, and then re-inspected by me, at my pace, until I am fully satisfied. And the cost of all this additional labor, the new sanitation officer, and any lost product will be entirely borne by AgriCorp. Ms. Harrington, who had been listening in horrified silence, finally spoke. That's an impossible demand. It's an effective takeover of our internal processes. And the cost of the lost product alone. The cost of a public health crisis is far greater. Ms. Harrington, I cut in. Imagine the headlines, AgriCorp poultry linked to nationwide salmonella outbreak due to filthy trucks. That's the alternative. My terms, or I continue this inspection for as long as it takes. And given the Senator's earlier inquiry, I'm confident the USDA will back me completely when I cite your continued non-compliance as a severe, systemic threat to public health. I had them. Utterly. Their carefully constructed edifice of corporate power was crumbling under the weight of a 40-year-old feather regulation. The thought of the multi-million-dollar damage my meticulous work was inflicting brought a quiet, profound satisfaction. This wasn't just revenge. It was a powerful, undeniable assertion that even the smallest, most overlooked regulation could bring down a titan if wielded with precision and unwavering resolve. Victor Sterling looked from me to Ms. Harrington, then back to the grounded trucks. The desperation in his eyes was palpable. He knew I had won. "Fine," he choked out, the word barely audible. "We accept your terms. Just release the trucks. Please." I smiled. "Not yet, Mr. Sterling. The inspection continues. The trucks will be released when I deem them compliant. And that will be a very, very thorough process." I watched Victor Sterling and Ms. Harrington walk away, defeated. My tiny, obscure regulation had achieved what no amount of polite requests or stern warnings ever could. I had brought AgriCorp to its knees. The systemic change and the lingering feather. The rest of the week was a strange blur of exhaustion, paperwork, and deeply satisfying tedium. AgriCorp, having capitulated, was now scrambling to meet my non-negotiable terms. The entire logistics bay became a madhouse of high-pressure cleaning teams working around the clock, stripping down every single refrigeration unit and chassis to surgically sterile standards. They worked frantically under the heat of the July sun, knowing that every hour spent cleaning was an hour their profits bled out. I, meanwhile, adhered strictly to my 4-hour per truck reinspection schedule. I didn't rush. I didn't slow down. I was the personification of steady, methodical federal compliance. I reinspected the first 3 trucks that I had initially cited, and, thanks to the massive panic washing, they finally passed. Truck 4, however, provided a moment of pure, glorious validation. After 8 hours of intense, focused cleaning by a team of 4 professional sanitizers, I began the reinspection. I worked my way back to the license plate frame, the spot where I had found the fragment of an insect wing. The AgriCorp cleaning supervisor, a nice man named Hector who was clearly having the worst week of his life, hovered 10 feet away, muttering prayers in Spanish. I ran my pick along the seam. I found nothing. I went to the second seam, where the tail bumper met the frame. Nothing. Then, I remembered a tiny detail from the manufacturer's technical diagrams I had been reviewing days before. The small, almost imperceptible weep hole, designed to drain condensation from the internal frame of the bumper housing. It was no bigger than the lead of a pencil. I inserted the very tip of my pick, gave it a gentle twist, and pulled it back out. Adhered to the steel was a tiny, compacted speck of what looked like dried mud. But under my magnifying glass, the horror on Hector's face confirmed my suspicions. The speck was entirely composed of heavily compressed, oxidized chicken feed dust, which absolutely counts as extraneous animal material. "Truck 4, I announced, loud enough for Hector to hear, but calm enough to be infuriating. Violation reconfirmed. Extraneous animal material found within the bumper weep hole. This indicates a failure in the pre-cleaning flush protocol." Hector threw his hands up and walked away, utterly broken. They had cleaned the outside but ignored the mechanical points of failure where contaminants could hide. The cleaning was superficial, not systemic. I issued the second notice of non-compliance on Truck 4. This, of course, meant the mandatory cleaning process, now including an internal flush of the bumper system, had to be repeated, and the release of the truck was pushed back another 8 hours. This single failure was the key that unlocked the systemic change I had demanded. AgriCorp's internal documents, their hack plan, and their daily sanitation checklists were based on visual cleanliness, not regulatory cleanliness. They were cleaning the stage, not the engine. Over the next few days, the remaining fleet was finally cleared, truck by agonizing truck. By the time the final truck, Truck 20, was released on Friday evening, a full 4 days late, the cost to AgriCorp in lost product, contract penalties, emergency cold storage, and labor had exceeded $15 million. Victor Sterling did not reappear. He was, I later learned, temporarily reassigned to a remote facility in Arkansas, a corporate exile. The person who finalized the compliance agreement with me was the CEO himself, Mr. Thompson, who flew in specifically to sign the documents. The meeting was brief and frosty. Thompson, a tall, gaunt man who looked like he hadn't spoken to an inspector in 20 years, sat across from me in a borrowed office trailer. "Inspector Ridley," he said, pushing the signed document across the table. It was a formal agreement stipulating the creation of the new USDA reporting sanitation officer position and the complete overhaul of their cleaning protocols. You have cost this company a significant amount of money and reputation. We will never forget this. Mr. Thompson, I replied, taking the document and stacking it neatly on my clipboard. I haven't cost you anything that wasn't already owed. You were non-compliant. The purpose of the USDA is to ensure that the public trust in your product is upheld. If you had prioritized public health over logistical convenience, none of this would have happened. Consider this an extremely expensive lesson in reading the fine print of the Code of Federal Regulations. He stood up, towering over me. The feather standard. 1983. You used a technicality to inflict maximum damage. I gave him the same bland, impenetrable smile I gave Victor. There are no technicalities in food safety, Mr. Thompson. Only degrees of compliance. Your company was operating under the assumption that if a violation isn't enforced, it doesn't exist. I simply reminded you that it does. The most satisfying part of the entire ordeal was the installation of the new sanitation officer. AgriCorp hired a former USDA veteran, a woman named Carol who was tougher and more methodical than I was. Her office was established right on the loading dock, and her entire budget was dedicated to ensuring AgriCorp didn't just meet the letter of the law, but the spirit of it. She reported directly to me, sending weekly compliance logs, photos, and training updates. I continued to inspect the AgriCorp facility for the next 6 months. My relationship with the floor staff, who had always respected my dedication, actually improved. The workers were proud of the new cleanliness standards, and the plant managers, chastened by the multi-million-dollar catastrophe, treated my visits like religious holidays, preparing detailed reports days in advance. Victor Sterling never returned. The memory of the ordeal, however, was cemented forever in the AgriCorp lexicon. They didn't call it the transportation vehicle audit or the sanitation protocol overhaul. They called it the feather incident. Every new employee, every new manager, was told the story of how Inspector Ridley shut down the entire logistics operation over a single feather barbule found in a taillight. It was a legendary tale of bureaucratic precision and corporate comeuppance. Years later, I was walking the line at a different, smaller facility when a delivery truck pulled up. The driver, an older man I didn't recognize, got out. He looked at my USDA vest, then at his truck, and then back at me. He leaned in conspiratorially. You hear about AgriCorp? I used to work there. They got a whole new cleaning protocol for the trucks now. They call it Riddler-proofing. They even have a special dental pick they use just for the weep holes. I smiled, my quiet, inner victory secured. Seems like a thorough system, I said. He nodded gravely. You don't mess with the USDA, man. You really don't. You might think it's just dust, but to them, that's $15 million in fines. I just tipped my head, checked his manifest, and walked on. I had won the battle, but more importantly, I had changed the system. And somewhere, perhaps still stuck in the insulation of that first truck's refrigeration unit, a single, persistent chicken feather silently asserted the non-reviewable power of the Code of Federal Regulations. The dormant standard ascendant. The months following the feather incident were, for me, the quietest and yet the most professionally rewarding of my career. The AgriCorp facility, once a constant headache of corporate entitlement, became the quietest, most compliant plant in the region. That was entirely thanks to Carol, the former USDA veteran I had effectively installed as their mandatory, federally reporting sanitation officer. Carol was a perfect, unyielding bureaucratic machine. Her weekly reports were things of beauty, triple-checked compliance logs, photographs of internal cooling unit seals labeled with date and timestamps, and, my personal favorite, a detailed log of all extraneous animal material found, categorized by type, feather barbule, dried insect carcass, rodent dropping fragment, etc. AgriCorp was paying her 6 figures, and she was making them work for every penny. The initial goal had been revenge for a personal slight. The final result was a template for genuine systemic change. I started receiving internal USDA queries from other districts, Inspector Ridley, Can you provide the exact methodology you used for the Section 4C2 visual inspection? We are having issues with consolidated meat packers. I had inadvertently become the agency's foremost, and perhaps only, expert on the application of the 1983 Feather Standard. My direct supervisor, Chief Willis, reacted to the whole ordeal with a masterful performance of controlled chaos. When the senator's call came, he had been apoplectic, terrified of a career-ending congressional inquiry. But once the senator hit the non-reviewable wall of CFR 381.185(c), Chief Willis realized he hadn't backed a loose cannon, he had backed a winning strategy. Alex, he told me during my mandatory post-mortem review, leaning across his desk, his voice low, you caused a multi-million-dollar panic. The secretary's office got calls from D.C., from Bentonville, Walmart, and from the White House Economic Council. You shut down 40% of the regional poultry supply for 4 days. But, he paused, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. You were 100% compliant. You followed the letter of the law when everyone, including AgriCorp's entire legal department, claimed that letter was dead. You didn't break a single protocol. You just highlighted one that was dormant. The conclusion was unexpected. Instead of an investigation, I was transferred. Not exiled, but promoted. I was brought into the Regional Compliance Office and given a new title, Regulatory Integrity Specialist. My new job was not to walk the plant floors anymore. My job was to do exactly what I did to AgriCorp, but on a strategic level. I was tasked with reviewing the 500-plus pages of dormant or obsolete federal regulations, the ones everyone ignores, and determining which ones could be legally and effectively weaponized to force systemic compliance from the largest, most resistant conglomerates. This was the real victory. Victor Sterling had tried to treat me like a grunt whose only value was signing a piece of paper. Now, I was a bureaucratic artillery piece, using decades-old regulatory language to redesign entire corporate infrastructures. My first task as Regulatory Integrity Specialist was to prepare a memo on the strategic deployment of the dormant standards. I felt a thrill compiling that document. I wasn't just Alex the inspector, I was Alex the rulemaker, or at least, the rule enforcer of last resort. Excerpt from internal USDA memo, Strategic Deployment of Dormant Standards, the AgriCorp Model. Objective: shift corporate compliance focus from visible cleanliness to systemic integrity. Case study, CFR 381.185. The Feather Standard. This regulation was successful not because of the threat of contamination, but because of the certainty of non-compliance due to design flaws, weep holes, seam crevices. The enforcement achieved a compliance leverage multiplier, CLM, of 10,000:1. Microscopic violation yielding multimillion-dollar corporate overhaul. Recommendation: immediate focus on dormant regulations in Part 360, Structural Integrity of Facilities, and Part 417, Equipment Calibration and Maintenance Logs. We hypothesized that similar non-reviewable clauses can be found relating to the tensile strength of ceiling tile support wires, CFR 360.22, circa 1965. The maximum allowable humidity fluctuation in non-processing storage zones, CFR 417.88, circa 1978. Targeting these obscure standards forces companies to spend capital on infrastructure overhaul, not just superficial cleaning, thereby guaranteeing long-term safety improvements. The rank-and-file inspectors loved it. I went from being a nameless drone to a minor legend. When I visited plants now, not to inspect, but to consult, the young inspectors would give me the silent nod, the universal sign of respect for a civil servant who fought the big guys and won. But the story wasn't quite over. Victor Sterling, exiled to AgriCorp's remote Arkansas facility, a place I had previously inspected that had fewer than 10 trucks and one perpetually broken air conditioner, was still seething. I found his attempt at revenge not in a legal challenge, but in a subtle act of corporate espionage directed back at me. Carol, my trusted overseer at the main plant, called me one Tuesday morning. Alex, I just got an internal memo from Arkansas. It was sent to all regional facilities, signed by Victor Sterling. It's a new best practice guide for loading dock procedures. What's the practice? I asked, immediately suspicious. It's harmless, almost ridiculous. It mandates that all truck drivers must now carry a specific, USDA-approved, stainless steel toothpick on a lanyard. They must use this toothpick to manually check the wheel lug nut depressions for debris before every departure. His citing, best practices for microparticulate containment. His turned the feather standard into a performance art parody. I realized what Victor was doing. He knew he couldn't fight the regulation, so he was trying to make the entire concept of meticulous compliance look so utterly absurd and petty that the workers would revolt, thereby devaluing my enforcement. He was weaponizing exaggeration. He was throwing shade on the very standard that had crushed him. His trying to poison the well, Carol, I told her. His making compliance look like kindergarten arts and crafts. Send me the memo. We need to counter this with an official, legally mandated tool. The fight had shifted from the loading dock to the policy printer, and I was about to use my new regulatory authority to not just mandate a policy, but to mandate a specific, expensive, and utterly necessary piece of equipment that would validate Victor's parody as a necessity. I knew exactly which CFR section on specialized tooling I would cite. Victor had made his play, but he had given me the perfect opening to escalate the bureaucracy once more. My revenge was not complete until his satirical toothpick was replaced by a mandatory $50 stainless steel pressure gauge that he would be forced to pay for. The mandated tool and the counter-weaponization. Victor Sterling's pathetic attempt at bureaucratic satire, the mandated stainless steel toothpick on a lanyard for checking lug nut depressions, was the perfect setup. He meant it to be a laughingstock, an exaggerated symbol of overregulation. I, however, saw it as a glorious, unintentional invitation. Using my new role as regulatory integrity specialist, I drafted a regulatory interpretation bulletin that was both devastatingly effective and utterly beautiful in its bureaucratic precision. The bulletin was titled, Official Clarification Regarding Specialized Tooling for Microcontaminant Inspection in Transport Vehicles, CFR 417.88, Appendix F. CFR 417.88 dealt with equipment maintenance and calibration. Appendix F, a forgotten relic from the late 70s, outlined the required specifications for specialized inspection tooling used in moisture and particulate detection. It was intended for internal plant equipment, but I found a loophole. The wording included any external equipment or transport mechanism designed to maintain or protect the integrity of the inspected product. My memo stated, while Inspector Sterling's initiative regarding the detailed inspection of wheel assembly particulates is commendable, the ad hoc use of non-calibrated, uncertified implements, such as the unverified stainless steel toothpick, fails to meet the standards set forth in CFR 417.88, Appendix F. Such implements do not provide quantifiable data regarding the pressure or depth of particulate adherence, which is critical for determining the viability of microbial colonization. Therefore, for all USDA-inspected food transport vehicles, the use of a specifically calibrated particulate adhesion sensor and depth gauge, PASDG, is now mandatory. I went further. I didn't just mandate the tool, I specified the manufacturer, the model number, and the required quarterly recalibration schedule, citing 3 different sections of the CFR to back up every single requirement. The specified tool was a high-end, purpose-built Japanese device used in aerospace inspection, an exquisite piece of stainless steel and micromechanics. It cost AgriCorp exactly $850 per unit. Since AgriCorp owned 1,500 refrigerated transport units nationwide, Victor's petty toothpick joke was about to cost the company over $1.2 million, plus the perpetual cost of quarterly certification by an approved third-party vendor. I sent the bulletin through the official channels. It was signed by Chief Willis, who was now fully on board with my method, viewing me as his secret weapon, and distributed to every single major meat and poultry corporation in the region, with AgriCorp's CEO, Mr. Thompson, receiving the first copy. Thompson called me 20 minutes later. His voice wasn't angry this time. It was weary, laced with a strange mixture of admiration and despair. Ridley, he sighed. You found Appendix F. Nobody has read Appendix F since Nixon was in office. That's an aerospace tool. We're hauling chicken, not shuttles. Mr. Thompson, Your product is transported in a temperature and atmosphere-controlled environment, making the transport mechanism a critical component of food integrity. The law is clear on the need for calibrated tooling to verify sanitation. I didn't write the law, sir. I just interpret it. And your Mr. Sterling's ill-advised memo provided the perfect legal pretext to enforce this higher standard. Thompson paused. He was trying to make a joke. He was attempting to undermine federal authority through mockery. I responded with superior authority through compliance. I am simply replacing his satire with regulation. The new mandatory tool was the final, devastating blow. It wasn't just the $1.2 million expense. It was the psychological victory. Victor Sterling, exiled to Arkansas, had attempted to send a poison pill, and I had turned it into a massive, mandatory corporate expenditure, the most expensive toothpick in U.S. food safety history. The repercussions weren't limited to AgriCorp. My memo had hit the entire industry. For years, major corporations had relied on the assumption that if an inspector couldn't see a violation, it didn't exist. Now, they were mandated to buy expensive equipment to prove quantitatively that subvisual violations didn't exist. Compliance departments across the country began frantically hiring retired inspectors like me, offering massive consulting fees to riddler-proof their operations. I took great pleasure in accepting the occasional, high-paying, off-the-books consulting job, always outside my region, of course, and always fully disclosed to the USDA. My fee was simple. I'd find the dormant standards that could destroy their system, and they'd pay me handsomely to fix them before a federal agent, like me, enforced them. It was perfectly ethical and wonderfully lucrative. Months later, I received a final, strange communication. It wasn't official. It was a thick, unmarked envelope sent to my home address, originating from Arkansas. Inside was a single, laminated photograph. The photo was a blurry, grainy close-up of a wall in a dingy, industrial office, presumably Victor's new office in Arkansas. Tacked to the wall, next to a calendar, was a printout of the first notice of non-compliance I had issued against Truck 3. Below it, scribbled in what looked like permanent marker, was a single, concise quote from the Code of Federal Regulations. CFR 381.185, the Feather Standard. And below that, in smaller, almost manic handwriting. There are no technicalities in food safety, only degrees of compliance. A. Ridley. Victor had turned my ultimate victory statement into a perverse, motivational poster. He hadn't just been defeated, he had been indoctrinated. He was defeated by the rule of law, and he had internalized the lesson so deeply that he was now preaching it, however bitterly, to his new, lower-tier staff. He was a bureaucratic ghost, still forced to reckon with the feather he had dismissed. I laughed, a rich, genuine laugh that I hadn't realized I needed. I tacked the photo to the bulletin board in my new, spacious USDA office, not as a trophy of revenge, but as a reminder that the most powerful weapon in the world isn't a lawsuit or a political connection. It's an old, overlooked, and impeccably applied federal regulation. The paper cutter slices both ways, and I had perfected the cut. My revenge was complete. It wasn't just about Victor losing his job. It was about him losing his corporate arrogance and being forced to serve the very concept he had ridiculed. He had become a footnote in the story of the Feather Standard, a standard I had resurrected.